Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
Sealed, accusing the former CEO of Arrow Trucking of, among other things, bank fraud. The former CEO of Arrow Trucking, James Doug Peelsticker, out of jail after facing a federal judge in Dallas today. He's accused of defrauding Transportation Alliance Bank out of more than $15 million, along with the IRS. Some of that money going to buy a Porsche, Bentley, and a Maserati. 2 News reporter Liz Bryant just spoke with a former Arrow driver and joins us now live from Catoosa. Liz.
And Libby, that former Arrow truck driver, now works here at Melton Truck Lines in Catoosa. He said he had to get this job real fast. He was, of course, suddenly out of a paycheck. He started working here just 2 weeks after. So Raymond Lewis tells me that he was suddenly stranded in Lexington, Kentucky about 5 years ago in 2009, just 3 days before Christmas. He had 11 missed calls on his cell phone just to find out he was out of a job by Arrow. Now he tells me that he got $400 out of the bank to go rent a car and drive back home. He also says that he is relieved because, well, Arrow Trucking's former CEO, Doug Peelsticker, quote, got what was coming, as Raymond said.
I went to work for Arrow in '99 when Daddy was still alive, so he knew what he did. Hope him and his second wife is very happy.
Now let's.
And that gentleman that they are talking about is this man, Doug Peelsticker, who between the time he took over the business from his father in the early 2000s until 2009, admittedly ran Arrow Trucking into the ground, using it as his own personal piggy bank. And that's what today's episode of Keto and Crime, a Keto and Crime classic, is about. Is how a spoiled brat took down an entire company and left thousands of drivers stranded 3 days before Christmas with no way to get home. And how a basically network of truck drivers came together to assist them. And with that, let's dive into the story of Arrow Trucking. Hey everybody, welcome to Keto and Crime, and for those of you listening out in the podcast verse, welcome to Thought Crime. Today we have a very interesting case, one that is actually pretty important to me because my dad was a truck driver for most of my life, and then he transitioned into being a welder. But I was used to the trucker's life. I used to ride with him quite a bit, learn the CB lingo. It was a lot of fun. And today we're going to be talking about the Arrow trucking scandal and some other trucking scandals that have taken place recently, like about February of 2019. So I thought you would, for all of my blue-collar, roll-on 18-wheelers kind out there, let's jump in. And again, I apologize for those on my YouTube channel, this being a little late. I woke up Sunday morning with that much of a voice. My throat is still pretty sore, but I am able to talk, so we're going to try to bang this out. So let's get into it. We're talking about Arrow Trucking, which was based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from its inception in 1968 through about 2009 when it went belly up. It was a regional transportation giant, mostly flatbed, but it did operate 1,300 trucks, 2,500 trailers. In 1968, it was purchased by Jim Peelsticker, who was a Tulsa native, had gone to school at the University of Oklahoma in Oklahoma City, and became a corporate lawyer. But unfortunately, he was kind of bored with the corporate law life and wanted to kind of have a more hands-on type of company, something that he could work and see grow rather than just, helping corporations pay less taxes and, getting people out of trouble that maybe they should have gotten in. So with a business partner, he bought 3 trucks and 3 flatbed trailers, which would eventually become Arrow Trucking. And in just a few years, its heyday was definitely in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It had grown into, as I said, 1,300 trucks, 2,500 trailers with an employment force of approaching 2,000 when you consider the truck drivers, the warehouse workers, the office workers, and everything else that it takes to run a trucking company. So he was one of the major employers in Tulsa, Oklahoma during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. He was married to Carol Pilsticker, who was also a student at the University of Oklahoma, and they had 2 children. The youngest of which is the main focus of our case today. Doug Pilsticker was born in 1968, around the same time his dad started Aero Trucking. He had a very privileged upbringing, went to private schools, was doted on by his mother, Carol, and a lot of people said that he became very spoiled. As a result, he was a, I want it and I want it now and I don't want the cost of it. I don't care what the cost of it is type of boy. He grew up, finished high school, had no plans to go to college. To quote Carol, all he wanted to do was smoke weed and lay around the house. He would rarely get up before noon, wouldn't work, and just kind of spent his father's money. He would turn up at Aero Trucking once a week to get the allowance that Jim Pilsticker gave to him. And that was his life until his parents, on a lot of insisting, very much insisted on cutting him off unless he went to college. And he did. He went to the University of Oklahoma, where he studied business, but managed to flunk out after a couple of semesters when it was discovered that he was kind of ill. But that didn't even dissuade him. He came back home for a while and then took off for Los Angeles, California, where he spent much of the 80s and early 90s trying to make it as a model and an actor, and he actually did pretty good. He didn't get a single job, didn't book a single shoot. Actually just spent his parents' money out there as well. They kept him in the high life. He actually passed out during a shopping spree in Long Beach, and it was discovered that he had a very low heart rate, and they had to actually put a defibrillator inside of him to keep his heart rate normal. So it was discovered that the illness that he had had during college was a heart problem. So as a result, his parents wanted him to come back home. He moved back home, lived with his parents, and eventually was convinced by his dad to come to work at Aero Trucking. Now, his father had at first said, well, you can start like I did and start as a driver, because his father in the early days, there was 2 business partners, there were 3 trucks. They hired one driver, they drove the others, as well as doing the other tasks around building a business, and it kind of went from there. So he wanted his son to start as a driver so he could understand what drivers go through on the road and why they're so important to a trucking company. But unfortunately, after running background checks on his son, the same kind of background checks any company has to run on an applicant to put them through CDL school, discovered that Jim had multiple reckless driving charges as well as a DUI he never told his parents about. So the chances of him getting a CDL license was about the chance that a snowball would have in hell. So no driving of the truck for Doug Pilsticker. Instead, his father put him to work in the communications department of Aero Trucking, which is technically the dispatch area. And when he showed up for work, most people said that he came in kind of glassy-eyed. He wasn't really there. He looked like he had slept in his clothes. When he attended meetings, he just kind of stood there and sniffed. And people often wondered if he was even paying attention. So Doug Pilsticker was not the model employee. Finally, his dad decided in the early 90s that it was time for him to really come into his own at Aero, so he actually promoted him to the executive staff and gave him a junior executive position in the marketing department, hoping this would kind of straighten him out. And it didn't really work for him. The only thing it did motivate him to do was to think, oh, I need to be like my dad and get married and start a family. So on a trip to Dallas, Texas, Doug Pilsticker met his first wife in a strip club in Dallas, Texas, brought her back, married her. The Pilstickers were actually pretty embarrassed about how their son had met his first wife and told people they had met at a Blockbuster video. how's this for nostalgia? He bought his wife a new Porsche. He wined and dined her. His dad paid for their wedding and also bought them a 20-room mansion in Tulsa, Oklahoma to live in. So Doug was working as an executive, a junior executive at Arrow, and managed to marry the woman of his dreams, I suppose, not shaming anybody that was a stripper. It's just very fitting for this gentleman, and ended up having 2 children with her. Now, before we get deeper into what actually happened at Arrow, let's talk about trucking. As I said, my dad was a truck driver. I actually worked in logistics on the dispatch side for several years, so I kind of had a great appreciation for the logistics industry. But when in truck drivers, you have 3 different tiers, and the reason I'm going to talk about this is because all of these people were affected by what happened at Arrow. You have company drivers, which are employed fully by the company. They get paid by the mile, usually somewhere between 35 cents to 50 cents a mile. 55 cents a mile is now the going rate for company truck drivers. They have benefits, all sorts of things like that. So that's the first tier. Second tier would be your lease to work drivers. These are drivers that also work for the company technically, but they're independent contractors. They actually lease their trucks, whereas a company driver will have pay, benefits, and they will just come and get a company truck, and they will do their loads, bring their loads back into one of many distribution centers or hubs that a trucking company will have around the country to get their trucks serviced and things like that. And then they will go about their merry way, come back for their next shift, get another company truck, and head out. Whereas a lease-to-loan operator actually rents a truck from the company. So instead of having to make a truck payment, they pay a certain amount out of their check every week to have their truck. So they may pay $500, $600, $700 a week to the company, but they have their truck. But they are responsible then for all the maintenance, oil changes, gas, everything that the company would pay on a company truck. And you may say, well, Tracy, what's the advantage of that? Well, a lot of people like it because most of the time the going rates for a lease-to-own operator is somewhere around 85 cents to $1.25 a mile. So it's a lot more money. And if you're a wise operator, you can make good money even though you're renting your truck. And also, it allows you eventually to buy that truck at a reduced price, so you can move up to the third tier of truck driver, and that's an owner-operator. That is literally somebody that goes out, buys an 18-wheeler, and basically rents himself out to different companies to take their loads at a much bigger price per mile. So that's the top tier. My dad was a company driver, and eventually he was an owner-operator, so I've seen both sides. And my dad was a gas truck driver, so he had his hazardous materials license, which paid him a lot more money, but we won't get into all that. So that's kind of how trucking works. And in addition to that, you have hubs around the country that are owned by these trucking companies where the trucks come in and out. They get their maintenance, they get their parts. And so you have people that work there, making sure the loads are loaded and unloaded as they should be, making sure the correct drivers get into the correct trucks, and always you have driver manager that works there. And this is the person that actually is the number one contact for the drivers. I was kind of that in the logistics company that I worked for. I was kind of the hub manager, so I was in contact with all of our drivers, whether they be employees, lease to owners, or owner operators. I was in touch with those drivers, and I kind of helped them out. So that's what I was. And then at corporate headquarters, you have the regular corporate structure, administrative assistants, marketing people, payroll, HR. So you had a lot of people that were depending on this company. And for a long time, Arrow Trucking was very, very successful until 2001. Jim Pilsticker and 5 other highly placed members of the Tulsa, Oklahoma business community went hunting in Canada. Now, it was nothing for Jim Pilsticker to go up to Canada. He owned hunting land in Canada. He owned hunting land in the northwest of the United States. Avid hunter, donated to conservation charities. Even though he liked to shoot hunt and shoot animals, he also donated to make sure that those things were replenished. And I know there's a lot of people out there that don't like hunting, but I grew up in a family of hunters, and I can tell you that hunting does serve a very valuable service to the ecosystem, in that it usually reduces the population of certain animals so that they don't all starve to death. So he not only hunted, he also donated to conservation charities that did help replenish the food supplies and things of these animals. So, avid hunter, had been to Africa big game hunting a couple of times, avid hunter. And he went to Canada at least twice a year to hunt an elk and all the things that you would and moose, the things that you would normally see in Canada. And he took 5 of his friends with him. Well, they were staying at a lodge about 400 miles north of the United States border. They were staying on a lake, and the only way to reach their cabin was from airplane. So they had to rent a small Cessna to get them to and from the cabin to the hunting grounds. Well, the manager of the hunting lodge reports he heard the plane coming back to the lodge after they had been out a day of hunting, about 6 p.m., just as it was starting to get really dark. And he heard the plane coming in, and then went about his business and noticed that the hunters had not come in, because normally the plane would land on the water, it would kind of motorboat up to the dock, tie off, but the airplane would kind of motorboat up to the dock, and people would come in and come to the cabin and have their cigars and brandy and the things that hunters like to do. But unfortunately, he noticed after about 10 minutes no one was coming in, so he got worried and he ran out to the dock, and he noticed the plane upside down in the water. And there were bodies in the water, in the ice-cold water. It was about 34 degrees. So he ran down to the dock and he started pulling people up. There were people holding other people above water. There was one body that wasn't moving, that was face down in the water, and that turned out to be Charles Ryan, who's 50 years old, CEO of the Nordum Group, which was a huge financial company there in Tulsa. He was deceased. They pulled everyone in and realized there were still one member of the hunting party and the pilot still missing. And they called, of course, for rescue crews. They pulled the airplane out of the water, and in the cockpit were found the bodies of the pilot and 63-year-old Jim Pilsticker, who drowned while strapped into the airplane. Although there is a lot of conjecture on whether or not he actually drowned or that was killed on impact. They really don't know, because during the autopsy the lungs were filled with water, but still it could have been just because he was submerged. So we don't know exactly what killed Jim Pilsticker, all that he did die in a plane crash. As you can imagine, the people of Aero Trucking, because Jim was the type of owner that had, as I said, started as a driver, worked his way up. It was nothing for him to come out of a meeting with investors in his full 3-piece suit, see a load coming in, roll up his sleeves, take off his jacket and his tie, and go out and help the dock workers bring in a load. He was just that type of businessman. He would pay for, he's paid for college tuition for the children of some of his longtime employees. He paid for the funeral of an employee that didn't have a life insurance policy because of an illness when he died. He really took care of his employees. He was just that kind of guy. Google Jim Pilsticker. You'll see there are museums and monuments to him all over Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as you can imagine, people of Aero Trucking were devastated. When the announcement was made, you had grown men, burly truck drivers and burly warehouse workers falling to their knees in tears, holding each other, hugging each other, just because they did love Jim so much. Everything in his will went to his wife, Carol, who did say that she would not be selling the company. And everybody was relieved about that, because when a woman or a minority owns a company, they get a lot of tax breaks that Jim Pilsticker wasn't getting, so that was good for the company. However, she made a very, very poor decision in naming her son Doug. Yes, Doug, the failed actor, Doug the pothead, Doug the lame-ass excuse for a business person, head of Aero Trucking. He was the new CEO. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of worry throughout Arrow about that. His first act was to tell people he was going to run the company like it should have been ran from the beginning. He cut out all the he cut out a lot of benefits that the employees were getting when Jim was there, such as free food and things of that nature. He certainly never paid for anybody's college tuition or paid for anybody's funeral. He cut out all of that. He had an older sister that was an accountant living in Dallas that had been getting a stipend from her dad once a year to kind of help her with business expenses. She never asked for anything. She never worked at Arrow, but she was pretty well-known accountant in her own right. He cut off her stipend. He cut off everything that did not benefit him. Let's just put it that way. He also fired his father's entire executive team, bringing in his two friends. Both of them had never really worked in transportation. One worked for a car rental company. The other worked at a bank. He brought in Jonathan Moore, who became Arrow's chief financial officer. The third one in 2 weeks, because he had hired two more and fired them straight away because they told him the truth about some of the decisions he was making and how they could be bad for the company. Doug did not want to hear that. He only wanted to hear that he was a god among men. So he fired them, and it settled on Jonathan Moore, who was a yes man, would tell him everything he wanted to hear. And he also hired Joseph Morey, who had been a lawyer, worked at a bank. He hired him as Arrow's chief legal counsel. He also immediately sold off all his father's hunting property and a ranch he owned outside of Dallas for about $16 million. Pocketed that. And so some of his first decisions were to completely renovate the executive offices at Arrow, which were not needed. The offices were not in bad shape. They just weren't as stylish as Doug Pielsticker wanted them. So he hired the #1 interior designer in the Southwest to come in and redo his offices to the tune of about $2 million. And then decided they still weren't good enough for him. He didn't want to be close to the noisy trucks and things like that. CEO of a trucking company does not want to be near the noisy trucks. Moved out of the corporate office and moved to a smaller office that he leased for himself in downtown Tulsa and said, I can run the company from here. So anything he could do to waste money. During that time, he also billed about $60,000 in travel expenses per month, where he would fly to Europe and to the Bahamas and things like that on vacation. He also funded a private investigator to tell his still first wife, because he suspected she was cheating on him. Comes to find out she was cheating on him with another woman. And as a result, he divorced her, was able to retain custody of both children, but still had to pay her alimony of, I believe, $3,000 a month. And also bought a brand new car just about every month. And we're talking BMWs, Mercedes, Maseratis, Porsches, Lamborghinis, the high dollar stuff. So he had a lot of lavish habits. During this time, he got involved with his children's nanny and ended up marrying her, courted her by buying her a new car. She returned the favor and bought him a Ducati motorcycle, all paid for on Arrow Trucking's American Express card. They also got married, had a $3 million wedding, which was also paid for by Arrow. The cake was so big that it took a flatbed truck to bring it in. The layers had to be broken apart. It was that tall that a standard delivery van couldn't handle it, even broken apart. And continued a lot of lavish spending without one thought about how business was actually going. Even though Arrow had some long time contracts, when you get somebody like this at the helm, things start to fall through the cracks. You're like, Tracy, it's not against the law to be a schmuck. No, it's not. So for the longest time, some of his were just bad spending decisions. Robbing the company for his own personal expenses, just kind of being your overall schmuck. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He started losing some contracts because things were starting to be late. He had laid off a significant amount of the workforce to save money. He fired veterans and hired new people. that were at a cheaper rate. So some things started to fall through the cracks just a little bit, and he started losing some contracts, all things that happen in a normal business day. And then when he started losing contracts, cash flows started to come up short. And basically, there came to a point in 2008, early 2009, where Arrow could no longer afford to pay their repair bills or to pay the bill on their gas card. So Doug Pilsticker started taking out lines of credit at banks to cover all of this, and it finally got down to the point he could no longer afford to keep all the trucks in the fleet working, so he would keep a few of them, and they kind of instigated what's known as a rob and repair rule. They were robbing trucks that had been permanently parked for their parts to keep working trucks in working order, and as you can imagine, there's no inventory system for that, so parts started disappearing, and people have surmised that there were probably a good $100,000 in truck parts that were stolen by employees during this time. So not everybody was the blue-collar workers were not entirely innocent, as you can see. But along the lines of they had paychecks that were bouncing. Not a lot, but ever so often somebody's paycheck would bounce. They would always make good on it, but it was starting to show a lot of red flags. Company drivers would pull into truck stops and gas stations to get gas. Gas cards would decline. They would take the trucks in for service to Ryder and Penske, who usually handle servicing of large trucks, and it would take them, instead of taking 15 minutes to get an okay on a work order for a truck, it would sometimes take them 5 or 6 hours, and then payment would be declined, so it would take them a while to get the truck back out. So a lot of things were kind of happening. And then the greatest fraud of them all started. This is where actually it kind of went from just being an internet manager to being a fraudster. In late 2009, they reached their $28 million credit cap. And what that means is they could no longer borrow money for anything. So in 9 years, this guy ran through all their operating capital, all the money that was coming in from customers, as well as $28 million in credit. And that's one thing that Jim Pilsticker never did, is ran the company with debt. So Carol Pilsticker was starting to get really concerned. She hired back Jim's best friend to be the CEO, but even he couldn't save the company. It was sort of too far gone, because in early 2009, Doug Pilsticker started doing something that was most definitely fraud. A lot of trucking companies partner with transportation banks, and in this case, Transportation Alliance Bank in Utah. It's a commonly done thing. It's not necessarily illegal. It's just for companies that need cash flow immediately. They would rather have the cash on hand to use part of it and invest part of it instead of waiting 30 or 60 days to get paid from a client. So what these banks would do, these transportation banks, is loan them the money for incoming invoices or money owed, and then they would take the invoices. They would buy the invoices from the logistics company or from the trucking company at a discount, and then turn around and collect at a reduced rate, and then turn around and collect it from the customer. So Jim started doing that. Doug started doing that, something that Jim would never have done. So he partnered up with Transportation Alliance Bank and started basically selling invoices at a discount to get the money right here to keep the company going. However, at some point in time, a clerk made a mistake on an invoice and keyed it in incorrectly. He keyed it in for about $3,000 or $4,000 more than it should have been. A company owed them $5,000. The invoice was sent to Transportation Alliance Bank for $8,000, and they paid it. They didn't catch it. So Doug and his cronies realized, oh, we can make some quick money this way. So they started a dual invoicing system where there were the actual real invoices that came in from the customers, and then they would take those, duplicate them, up the amount, and send them to Transportation Alliance Bank. So a invoice came in for $10,000, they would send $15,000 to Transportation Alliance Bank. So there were two invoices. The actual invoice was kept in-house for IRS recording, the false invoice was sent to the bank and the bank would pay on it. Now, the bank did audit them several times, but never found a discrepancy because they had the dual invoice system. So they had the fake ones and the real ones. When the bank came in to audit them, they would have the fake ones on file and then the real ones on file in case of an IRS audit. Also around this time, Doug started dipping into the $14.3 million reserve account, which was there to pay employee payroll taxes. So he quite literally ran this company into the ground. He sucked it dry for everything. And Transportation Alliance Bank finally caught on to what was going on and cut off the supply of money. And that fateful day was December 22nd, 2009, when all of it came crashing down. Donna Creekmore, a 15-year veteran employee of the company, the hub manager of their Tulsa, Oklahoma hub, was going in early on December 22nd, 2009 to attend a meeting with company executives where she suspected, due to a lot of the financial problems they were having, that she was going to be asked to take a cut in pay. And because she loved the company, she was willing to take that cut in pay and had already made up her mind to do such. But when she pulled up to the hub, she noticed locked gates, and she noticed a line of flatbed tow trucks lined up from Penske and from Ryder and from Peterbilt, the other companies where the trucks were either purchased, financed or purchased or leased. A lot of companies there to repossess trucks that payments had fallen in the rears. She had no idea that they weren't paying the bills on the trucks. So a lot of people were there to repossess a lot of trucks. She was able to get in. When she went in, she was told that the company was ceasing operations immediately and to let the drivers know. So she was automatically concerned. She sent out the message onto the truck's onboard messaging system, which is kind of like a electronic control panel where you can get real-time messages from your hub, and she immediately sent out a message, had the dispatcher send out a message letting them know that Aero Trucking is ceasing operations immediately. There's no money for gas, there's no money for repairs, get home the best way you can. And that was the message that was sent to drivers, about 1,000 of them that were out on cross-country runs on December 22nd, 2000. Donna, who came from a family of truck drivers, could not stand the thought, so she actually printed off a trucking log that would show where each driver was heading and where they would possibly be. She printed that off, she stuffed it into her purse, and she left for the final time, having not been paid for the last 2 weeks of work. She immediately went home. She said she was driving, expecting to see blue lights behind her because she had essentially stolen work papers. But she got home, she opened up her Facebook, and she started creating Facebook pages and forums and messaging people that she knew that worked at other trucking companies to help the drivers get home. Now, speaking of the drivers, now think about that. A lot of truck drivers, like a lot of people, live paycheck to paycheck. And when you're out, not all of them live in Tulsa, Oklahoma either. I mean, trucking, you can live anywhere as long as you can get to the hub. So a lot of these drivers are cross country, some out as far as California, Washington, Oregon, when they get this onboard message. Immediately, the company gas cards cut off, so there was no money for gas. You had people like Deanna Woods, who was in Matthews, Missouri. She actually was from Texas. They had just filled up her truck to the tune of $700 because she was delivering a load of shingles to a Lowe's in Oregon. Well, her gas card declined, and she had no way of paying a $700 gas club bill because everybody's paycheck had just bounced. So she was in a pickle. She tried to explain to the truck stop what happened. They immediately called the police. Her commercial driver's license was confiscated, and she was about to be taken to jail when the manager of the truck stop took pity on her when he found out what had happened and actually took her to breakfast. And while they were sitting there in the truck stop restaurant eating, she said they were talking about it, and by that time it was coming over the news and things like that. And so she said that a lot of truck drivers were starting to come up to her in the truck stop and put cash down on the table for her. And by the time her breakfast was finished, truck drivers had donated, and truck stop workers had donated to her $1,200, which was more than enough to pay for the gas, plus enough money for her to gas up her truck enough to get home. It's amazing how the network of people will come together when companies won't. So you literally had drivers stranded across the country. Some of them parked their trucks and trailers. Some people had to take to opening up the trailers and selling what was on them to get enough money to get home, to get bus tickets, to get gas, to rent cars, what have you. A lot of people drove their trucks to their houses and basically told people, if you want them, come get them. And so a lot of people were left stranded. That's the reason I always say have an emergency fund with you. Have at least $200 to $300 in cash on you, credit card, whatever you need, because you don't want to be caught like this. Immediately after the closure, there were class action lawsuits filed by employees and by former customers whose loads had simply disappeared during the Ho debacle. Like Deanna's load of shingles was just left sitting. She dropped the trailer so she could have better gas mileage on the truck to drive the truck home. And she left a truckload of shingles sitting at a Love's gas truck stop in Missouri. So you had people filing lawsuits to find stolen, what they called stolen or lost shipments. You had people filing lawsuits to get stolen wages, and the company was shuttered. It declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy the next day, and a trustee was appointed to recover what could be recovered. And the way this was recovered was auctioning. In 2010, there was an auction near Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all their trailers and trucks, the ones owned by the company, the ones that were not repossessed. And that fetched a few $1 million. And the case, it took several years for it to be settled. Eventually everybody got something, but I'm sure a lot of those employees never recovered their full wages. They were definitely in violation of the Warren Act, which says that any company that has over 100 employees is required to give 60 days notice of a mass layoff. They did not do this here. That was an absolute violation of the Warren Act. So that legislation and that court case is still pending. But the best part of this is that Doug Pielsticker, who you thought might have gotten away scot-free, was actually arrested in 2012 by federal authorities on tax evasions, because all that little money he had been stealing from the company for years to use for personal expenses was never claimed as part of his personal IRS return, as well as the $14 million set aside for employee paid taxes that had to be rectified, as well as the fraud against Transportation Alliance Bank, his part in it. And he was sentenced to 90 months for 1 count of tax evasion and 1 count of bank fraud, and he sits in a federal prison in Texas.
Guilty of a $25 million conspiracy that supported his luxury lifestyle. Before she went to cover that breaking news, Liz Bryant spent the day tracking the plea deal.
No words as he walked out of federal court this afternoon, but 46-year-old Doug Pielsticker's attorney agreed to take only my question.
Glad today to be able for Doug to stand up and take responsibility for his part in what happened at Aero Trucking, but only his part and not the part of others.
And this plea bargain, Pielsticker recaps 2009. Writing, as part of the conspiracy, funds from Aero Trucking Company were diverted, in part, to pay for my personal expenses. The U.S. attorney reduced 23 charges down to just 2.
Whether he pled to all 23 counts or 2 counts, he's still subject to the same sentence.
To this day. And believe it or not, this has not been the only trucking company. This was in 2009. In 2019, February, Falcon Transport out of Youngstown, Ohio, sent out the same sort of message to its employees and was shuttered in 1 day. Why? Not because of anything necessarily illegal, but because they had fallen on some hard times and had been purchased by a Wall Street firm that basically drained them dry of their assets and then closed them down. So this kind of thing happens all the time, guys. It's not always pleasant, but this one was not just an economic turn down. This one was complete and utter scandal and fraud. And I hope Doug Pilsticker thinks about every one of those employees he left in the lurch while he sits in jail. Anyway, guys, that's Keto and Crime for today, Thought Crimes for today. Be back with you real soon. Thank you so much. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Love you all. Keto Comic. Out.